We have our next speaker, Prof Harvey, is here with us. He's got an impressive CV, which is in the booklet. I'm not going to read through all of it, but other than him being at the University of Wits, he's also a previous practitioner with Fisher Hoffman Stolle, now PKF. He's going to share with us the role of the audit committee as far as compliance to financial reporting standards. However, I need to mention also is that he's the chairman of the Financial Reporting Investigation Panel.
Short slides, but I'd just like to introduce this with a little story which perhaps indicates where the concentration should lie and how some things are not always obvious. The fellow on the work site went to the foreman and he said, "Look, there's a problem here. The wheelbarrow is going ee, 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 ee." And the supervisor, furious, absolutely outraged, and then basted the worker from a dizzy height. Well, the person was walking by and said, "Why are you shouting at him? What's the problem?" He says, no, that wheelbarrow is supposed to be going ee, 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 ee." So the question is just where your focus is in all of this. But the first issue I want to deal with, and I see there's nothing on the slide at all. Oh, there you go. Is the question of the theory versus the reality. You will note, if you read the charters of most audit committees, if you really have a good look at them, you'll see 95% of them are completely unrealistic. That they attribute matters to the audit committee which the audit committee can't possibly deal with. The level of responsibility that they allocate to the audit committees. And the vast majority of audit committees take a template which they get typically from Big Four firms, so there's your advantage. And they just replicate that with their own name. But in fact, if you look at the kinds of responsibilities they are putting upon themselves, they simply can't do it. At a non-executive level, which is every audit committee, you can do no more than a broad oversight role. So when they put in the charter that they will assume the responsibility for the implementation of internal control, or the operation of internal control, or the minimization of risk, or proper reporting, or any of those, they're all misguided. Because all, at the best, the audit committee do is an oversight process to ensure that those things should happen. But you can't take the primary responsibility for those things. But we come back to the audit committees, and you'll see again in the charter a host of matters which they typically put at the door of the audit committee. And if those of you who are over 45 plus will recall that the original role of an audit committee in the old days was financial statements only. Your interaction with the auditor and financial statements only. And gradually it's grown by Topsy into all these other responsibilities. But that part of the audit committee's responsibility is still the most important, because you only have one communication with your shareholders, your investors, and that's via the financial statements. So that is the critical, at least insofar as it concerns the company dealing with external parties. And that's why it's so important that the audit committee is appropriately skilled. And we'll come to other reasons why it's got to be appropriately skilled. Otherwise, you're at the behest of those feeding into the audit committee. We'll have a look at that very briefly in a moment. So sound effects just to make sure you keep awake. If we look at the audit committee, what it can practically do is to establish the corporate culture regarding how the entity complies with international financial reporting standards, and indeed general compliance, but in particular for today's talk, IFRS. And what does that mean as a corporate culture? I've plucked out three issues, which is there a corporate culture of compliance? In other words, that at the tone at the top is that there should be compliance with all the standards, irrespective. and that the audit committee does have the ability to set that down, to push it down into the channels, to make sure that it's implemented underneath them, or at least that they take responsibility and recognize that that's what the audit committee wants. The next issue, which is really interlinked, is the question of how flexible the audit committee is in relation to non-compliance. What's their tolerance level? Now, what the tolerance level should be at the audit committee is nil for non-compliance, because you're there as an oversight function for management. So there shouldn't be any latitude given insofar as the application or the adherence to the standards is concerned. And that's again a message that has to be transmitted down from the audit committee to management and into the broader perspective, which means the auditors and the financial staff in particular. And then there's the old-fashioned one. You will know, of course, that prudence is now considered old-fashioned somehow, taken out of the framework long, long ago. And although if you read your psycho email today, one of the thousands they send us, you would have seen that the chairman of the IASB says it still exists. He's in dreamland. It doesn't exist as a self-standing concept at all. So what he's trying to suggest that somehow the standards themselves have built in a conservative issue. And for a few standards that's correct, but by and large it's not a self-standing concept. I'm not talking about that concept at all. I'm talking about its ordinary English context, that one should be at the audit committee level not only intolerant but conservative. And I mean in the conservative sense in the interpretation of IFRS. So, well, this is the way. What's the most conservative outcome? You will all know that for many instances there isn't a single answer, single accounting answer, that there are alternatives. The audit committee's role should say, well, we recognize there are alternatives. Which is the most conservative alternative? And that's the alternative that we want to advance at the audit committee level and push that down to the channel. Also make sure I keep attentive. I mentioned a while ago that you need high skills for the audit committee. It's a trite proposition, really. But if we look at the reliance, where you're relying on, and you're forced to rely in the audit committee, in the real world, large degree of reliance on the information given to you. Go and go out and verify things yourself. You have a crutch, which is the external auditor, you can lean on, and the internal auditor, assuming it's a third party fulfilling that role. But by and large, you are reliant on the information fed to you by management.